So at 4:30 p.m, stay tuned. The big India-China meeting coming up, the first in 5 years, and specifically after the tensions over line of actual control and incursions by China toward Ladakh. All eyes now will be on this big meeting coming up. Indian Prime Minister Modi and Chinese President Xi Jinping will be holding this bilateral, and in less than 2 hours, in fact, in the next 1.5 hours, this meeting that has been now scheduled. The image going viral meanwhile, how the Indian Prime Minister, Chinese President, standing, sharing a light-hearted moment and discussion. And in the center, perhaps to break the ice, is Vladimir Putin, Russian president, but also the host right now, as Russia is, where the summit is being organized in Kazan. So there are more visuals, images coming up where Prime Minister Modi is seen showing a thumbs up. This, in many ways, remember, is as much about the situation that is evolving. China cannot ignore India anymore, specifically because India has more and more global alliances. It's a multi-aligned power, non-aligned in many ways when it comes to conflict, and has a lot of goodwill across the world compared to China. China's economy also showing a downturn, the kind of stimulus that are not convincing according to the big organizations, while India is continues to show a rise in the economic growth. So these are the big visuals coming in. What will be on agenda at 4:30 p.m? Economic cooperation, trade and technology will be the highlights, as the agenda is for the BRICS summit. But more than that, remember, it will be about dialogue and diplomacy. Can India and China possibly end their differences, get together, because all of this is being watched by the Western nations. The USA, UK, Germany and of course Canada, they are not in the BRICS summit. The founding members, Brazil, Russia, China, India, have decided to also expand it, bring other countries. United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia has shown interest. South Africa joined about a few years ago, and that's why this, remember, could be becoming a new global alliance. So all eyes will be on this meeting. But there was already a photo opportunity. When the BRICS summit started, all the leaders got together. And I want to take you to that big image that is coming in. Look on your screen. And notice where India's positioning is. Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi standing right next to Vladimir Putin. That is much about the friendship that India and Russia share, but also about the two leaders, Prime Minister Modi and Vladimir Putin. And apart from this, also standing next to Prime Minister Modi is who he calls as a brother, a close friend from the United Arab Emirates. Apart from this, the focus now comes to Prime Minister Modi's meeting of bilateral talks with Xi Jinping. After 2020 clash in Galwan, this is going to be that first meeting. Two leaders will be holding, and the meeting will go across to about, we are told, about 40 minutes. But a consensus, while has been reached on the disengagement on LAC, here at the BRICS summit, the focus will be trade, technology, and other ties that India and China, as two big Asian powers, can actually build on. Remember that the last meeting, even though that was an informal summit in Mahabalipuram, it was in October 2019, and that was months before the incursion, so before the tensions really between India and China. So these are the top images coming right now from Kazan.
सर नमस्कार, मेरा नाम गौरव सावंत है. आई वर्क फॉर इंडिया टुडे एंड आज तक. सर, चीन के रुख में ये परिवर्तन आया कैसे आपकी दृष्टि में, और जब पेट्रोलिंग दोबारा रिज्यूम होगी तो फिर बॉर्डर पे ट्रूप्स के क्लैशेस ना हो जाएं, क्या इसका भी कोई मैकेनिज्म है? और डिसएंगेजमेंट तो हो रहा है, क्या डी एस्केलेशन और डी इंडक्शन की भी बात हो रही है?
अभी जो अरेंजमेंट्स और अभी तक जो समझौता हुआ है, उसे पहले हमें ग्राउंड पे इम्प्लीमेंट करना है. ये एनालिसिस की ये कैसे हुआ, इसको मेरे विचार में बाद में देख सकते हैं. आपने कहा कि जो आगे फेस ऑफ्स न हो, क्लैशेस न हो, उनको कैसे रोका जाए. मेरे विचार में बहुत ही ये एक अहम आपने सवाल, एक अहम मुद्दा उठाया है, और हमारी आशा है और हमारा प्रयत्न रहेगा कि जो अरेंजमेंट्स वर्कआउट हुए हैं, जिन पे समझौता हुआ है, वो ऐसे अरेंजमेंट्स हो जिनसे इस तरह के क्लैशेस रुक सकें, जो पीछे हुए हैं कहीं कहीं पे लाइन ऑफ एक्चुअल कंट्रोल के पास. तो इसमें आगे हमें देखना पड़ेगा और लगातार प्रयत्न करना पड़ेगा, लगातार कोशिश करनी पड़ेगी कि जो मैकेनिक्स हो, जो अग्रीमेंट के, वो ऐसे रहें कि इस तरह के जो क्लैशेस हैं उनको रोका जा सके. जहां तक आपका अंतिम प्रश्न है कि डिसएंगेजमेंट हो गया है या हो रहा है, और डी-एस्केलेशन और डी-इंडक्शन की बात कहाँ आती है, मैं फिर से यही कहूंगा कि अभी हमें पहले डिसएंगेजमेंट पे फोकस करना है और डी-एस्केलेशन और डी-इंडक्शन की बातें सही समय पे होंगी.
So let's go on the ground in Kazan in Russia, where India Today's managing editor Gaurav Sawant is reporting from. Gaurav, let's begin first, because while the focus is India-China meeting, I'm looking at this group photograph. When the BRICS summit started, right next to Vladimir Putin is the Indian Prime Minister, next to him is the UAE is the Crown Prince, but that's also reflective of the individual relationship these leaders have, isn't it? What do you make of India's positioning at the BRICS summit and on the global scale?
Well, when it comes to BRICS, India is a very critical pillar and a founder member of this organization. Brazil, Russia, India, China. That's how this grouping started. And then the next year, South Africa joined. So BRIC became BRICS. And ever since, it's only grown from strength to strength. Those who said that this is just an anti-West grouping, India's point constantly had been, and something that where Prime Minister Narendra Modi was quoted by the Russian President Vladimir Putin, it's not an anti-West grouping, it's just a non-West grouping. That's point one. Point two, it's a very, very powerful body, and each year it grows from strength to strength, where economic cooperation is something that takes them along. And what is India's principal role? India's principal role is that the global south or the developing world must be heard, and their interests must be kept in mind. That's the point India has been making even at G20. If you look at India's G20 presidency, what was India saying? The African Union should be made a part of G20. When the Russia-Ukraine conflict started and everyone wanted to impose massive sanctions and imposed massive sanctions on Russia, India said those sanctions should not be counterproductive and they should not adversely impact the developing world. So, when you need discounted oil from Russia, that discounted oil from Russia helps Indian economy and it helps economies of the developing world. Because if you only take oil from West Asia and the European market then gobbles up that oil and takes all that gas from the United States of America, prices will shoot up, and this will adversely impact the developing world. Money that should have been used for schools or for roads or for infrastructure development would go in buying oil. Discounted oil from Russia helped India. Re-export of that oil again helped India and helped those developing countries, including, incidentally, developed countries of Europe. They are buying that same Russian oil now through India. Point two. Point three, it's not just fuel, it's also fertilizers. Russia has huge energy supplies. Apart from energy, also fertilizers for Indian farmers, fertilizers for farmers in Africa, fertilizers for farmers in developing world. All of that comes from Russia. Now, if you put sanctions on Russia and the developing world does not get fertilizers, crop impact, food security, all of that gets adversely impacted. So India adopted a very rational approach in dealing with Russia, continuing to buy the discounted oil, continuing to get that fertilizer, continuing to get food grain from Russia, and also ensuring that, talking to Russia to ensure that food grain from Ukraine can come out through the Black Sea and be provided to developing countries. So in all of that, India has played a very critical role, and that critical role continues to expand. If I may just quickly add, India is a part of BRICS. India is also part of G20. India is a part of Shanghai Cooperation Organization. India is also a part of the Quad. So that just shows, in this world that's going through immense turmoil, India is a part of multiple groupings. India is multi-aligned and not non-aligned anymore.
Gaurav, so now let's come to the big highlight, the India-China bilateral meeting at 4:30 p.m. What kind of build-up happening there? What kind of, do you think, issues will be on agenda? Because while the announcement has come on the border issues, eventually it's trade, technology ties and much more between India and China that must also be discussed.
Eventually, it's trade, technology and ties. But initially, it has to be peace, tranquility and stability at the borders. So for trade ties to increase and improve, for economic relations to strengthen, there has to be peace, stability and tranquility at the borders. That's the basic prerequisite. And that's the critical difference in India's understanding of the situation and China's appreciation of this situation. China wants to keep India on the edge. China wants to ensure that the situation along the LAC remains in turmoil, remains in flux, where India is always reacting and responding to a situation. At the same time, trade, where the deficit is $85 billion in China's favor, and it continues to benefit from that. So they want access to Indian markets. At the same time, they want to keep India spending all our money on protecting our borders. This government, from what we've seen since 2020, they said nothing doing. In fact, even before that, 2017, the Doklam incident. Now, government of India has made it very clear. Peace and stability at the borders, tranquility at the borders is a basic prerequisite for any other aspect of this relationship to grow. So China for 4 years tried to put pressure on India. Wang Yi, their foreign minister, state councillor, he would repeatedly say, let's leave borders for a future generation to decide, and which has been the Chinese tactics right from the 1960s. The future generations will be smarter, they will decide, and they would keep salami slicing Indian territory and keep moving forward, year on year, or decade on decade, or they would come forward 4 kilometers and then go back 2 kilometers and then say, oh, see, we've gone back. But then they've already taken 2 kilometers. I'm talking about the salami slicing that used to happen earlier. At Doklam, India said nothing doing. Again, post Galwan, India said nothing doing. If they deployed 50,000 soldiers, India deployed 50,000 soldiers. If they brought in their rockets, India brought in the 155mm howitzers and also deployed other military hardware. If they brought in their armor, India deployed the T-90 and the T-72 tanks. India deployed the mechanized columns. They deployed airlifted. And this is where synergy between Indian Army and Indian Air Force had to be seen, that Indian Air Force was quickly able to move men and material. The C-17 Globemasters, amazing, look at that. American aircraft being used, American aircraft bought by Indian Air Force, C-17 Globemasters, C-130J Hercules, Chinook helicopters, heavy lift transport helicopters. They would undersling those tanks and 155mm howitzers, and again those M777s manufactured by America, lightweight howitzers. They were deployed at the borders. So that mirror deployment sent across a message to China, you don't mess around with this, India. And tanks were literally in an eyeball-to-eyeball situation. Tanks at that close, or India's QPQ operations on the Kailash Hills, which we've reported. Those QPQ operations forced China to rethink its strategy tactically, not strategically, tactically. They moved back from the Moldo, because we were dominating the Moldo garrison. They agreed to a disengagement, but that's only a disengagement and creation of buffer zones. For those who say that buffer zones were created only in Indian territory, well, entire Aksai Chin is also Indian territory. So a few kilometers here and there is, you can score political points, but it's your nation that is adversely impacted when you try and score these political points, because China takes advantage of this situation to put that psychological pressure on India. To the best of my knowledge, India refuses to come under that psychological pressure from China now, and the result is, before this BRICS summit, it's before every summit, that there has been some kind of disengagement, whether it's happening at SCO or BRICS at Xiamen, where 2017, when Prime Minister Narendra Modi, whether he'd go or not go, was a big question, and that's when China disengaged at Doklam. That shows that you have to meet China with strength, which is perhaps which we'll see here in a couple of hours from now. When India talks from a position of strength, China listens. So the bottom line is, you talk to China from a position of strength if you want to be taken seriously in this world order.
You did make a very important point here, Gaurav, that usually before the summits, there is a disengagement, at least what China appears to also promise. What happens later, that remains to be seen. What is your assessment, Gaurav, that this time the bilateral meeting is taking place? Because it would be foolhardy to believe that China suddenly wants to become friendly or an alliance partner with India. There's definitely a strategy at play, and India, of course, would do well to remember not just 1962, but even the recent past, that you have to be very cautious on how to proceed with China.
You're absolutely right, Pooja, but even if you were to see 1962, if we learn our history correctly, and unfortunately we haven't been taught our history correctly, wherever the Indian army stood and pushed the Chinese back, you were able to push them back. The moment Indians or whichever battalions or regiments thought that the Chinese were 10 feet tall and they would just come and take over territory, where the army did not resist the Chinese, they were able to advance. When you stopped them, they stopped, and then they went back. If people thought China was doing India a favor in 1962 by going back, it was not. China realized it could not retain those territories. It could not sustain itself, which is where China thought that it will be able to browbeat India, all along the line of actual control even this time. And when India did not buckle under pressure, China is also feeling the pain. However, China now is showing bigger capacity to withstand that pain by having massive military build-up all along the LAC. Their permanent defenses are coming up. Not every, and again, understanding and trying to study military strategy is extremely important, because not every action of the Chinese in eastern Ladakh is offensive. A lot of it is also defensive. And that indicates that China is also apprehensive India could do something. There are many who say, oh my God, the Chinese are coming. No, it's not, oh my God, the Chinese are coming. The Chinese are also deploying there in defense, where not every Indian capability there is defensive. Some of the Indian capabilities are also offensive. The QPQ operations were only a trailer of what India can do if India decides to do something. The Russia-Ukraine war has also taught us you could be Russia, but then if you are a Ukraine, you can still ensure that the war goes on for 2 years. Can China, with an aging population, with only one child, and that princeling being in the army, afford that kind of a battle with India, a battle of attrition? It clearly cannot. And the future battles will not be short, sharp, as we've seen across the world. It will not be short and sharp. It could be very long, and that is China's apprehension. So if their browbeating does not work, if their economy is also being adversely impacted, if the world is now shifting to manufacturing also in India, not just India, but also in India, and if India is able to close that gap, reduce that trade deficit with China, it will take us time to catch up. But once we catch up, we will race ahead, because we have a young population, and we have a population that believes in excelling. They do not have that advantage. So 10 years down the line and 20 years down the line, the equation could change drastically. We just have to stay the course. If you stay the course, you're on top of that situation 10 and 15 years down the line. It just remains to be seen whether India can actually stay the course or do something where we'll end up shooting ourselves in the leg, sadly, that we have done in the past too.
And fingers crossed that will not happen this time, that there will be more wisdom coming in with regard to the governments here on. And also, for example, what we've seen with Apple's manufacturing and assembling here, and more companies coming in. But importantly, and this is what I believe, that is India's goodwill across the world as a democratic ally, and people realize, and the countries realize, that more than China, it is India that they would like to believe with. Stay on with me, Gaurav, because eventually this focus of this bilateral is Ladakh, is the line of actual control. And India today is on the ground right now. It is at one of the strategic locations where we have been talking about whether it's disengagement, whether it's about the situation with the troops and more, and that is the north and south banks of Pangong Tso. Very close to that location is my colleague Shivani Sharma presently. Shivani sent us this ground report, and among the talks that are taking place, what is the situation on the ground in Ladakh, ground zero? Here's a report.
We are right now at the most strategic location when it comes to Ladakh and tensions between India and China. We are right now at the highest salt lake at 14,000 feet at the Pangong Tso, which has seen disengagement in February 2001 and also tensions escalating after the Galwan incident in 2020. You can see this lake, which is 160 kilometers long, 1/3 of its part is in India, while the 2/3 is with China. And on the northern banks, the spurs of the mountains, which are referred to as fingers, they are of different claims with both the countries. India has the claim that it has control till finger 8, and China says that it has only till finger 2, and that's where the patrolling tensions had emerged initially, and after which now an agreement has been reached where India and China say they will be resuming the patrolling to what they used to do before the Galwan incident. And here, when we talk about this Pangong Tso lake, we've seen how the disengagements happened from north and south of its banks in the first phase of disengagement in 2021, and thereafter we also saw disengagements happening from Hot Spring, Gogra, and several other key issues were resolved through dialogue between both the countries. 21 rounds of co-commander level talks happened, 31 rounds of WMCC meetings happened, and heavy deployment of forces remains along the line of actual control from Indian and Chinese side. More than 50,000 Indian troops are located. Not only the troops, but the weapons, the infrastructure has been immensely ramped up in these locations. When we talk about infrastructure, you can also see some significant points here too, be it the network of roads along the line of actual control, including the strategic locations like Pangongso, or the army establishments which have come up in these areas. A multi-fold deployment of forces has been done after the Galwan incident. But now, when Prime Minister Narendra Modi and President Xi Jinping are meeting, it is being assumed that the tensions will get released, because an agreement has been reached in which both the countries say that they will be resuming the patrolling rights, and disengagement will follow from the remaining areas that are namely Demchok and Depsang plains that have been the traditional friction points. But Pangongso remains a very important and a strategic location when we talk about India and China, the topography and how it is spread over between India and China. The army chief has already said that we need to wait and watch. We need to monitor how PLA is reacting after this agreement, so that the trust which India has lost with China comes back. So confidence building measure will be the focus for now for the Indian army after this agreement has been made, and after that disengagement will follow. So more details will emerge after meeting of Prime Minister Narendra Modi and President Xi Jinping, but on ground definitely impact is being awaited. This is Shivani Sharma with camera person Pawan Kumar for India Today from Pangongso.
So remember, the only channel right now on Ground Zero to help you understand that while talks have happened, announcements have been made, but what is the consequence of that on the ground where the troops are deployed? Listen in now to General V.K. Singh, former Army Chief, and what he has to say on India-China agreements on the disengagement, phased disengagement at the LAC.
देखिए, एक राजनयिक तौर पर बहुत आपस के अंदर वार्तालाप चल रहा था, कोशिश चल रही थी दोनों तरफ से कि किसी प्रकार से एक ऐसा वातावरण पैदा किया जाए जो दोनों के लिए ठीक हो। मैं ये कहूँगा कि एक अच्छा कदम है, क्योंकि इसके तहत दोनों देश आपस के अंदर एक सौहार्दपूर्ण वातावरण के अंदर बातचीत कर सकते हैं, और जो हम लोगों के इसके बारे में डिफरेंसेस हैं, जो जिनको हम सोचते हैं कि ये सही है वो गलत है, वो सोचते हैं, तो उनके ऊपर बैठकर शांतिपूर्ण तरीके से बातचीत की जा सकती है।
So now the focus, remember, amid all of that, will be at the India-China meeting. The bilateral that's taking place for the first time in 5 years, but a lot, remember, has to be discussed, specifically on a larger border breakthrough, because eventually, like we have been discussing, that there could be trade ties, there could be technology ties and economic cooperation. But eventually, India has to take a decision on what kind of stability we have at the border. At the line of actual control, there have been different points where, apart from Galwan, there have been tensions prevailing in the past few years. And therefore, it will be pertinent to know about what is the position that China intends to take, not just with regard to words, but actions. Indeed, there have been core commander level talks. There have been, remember, the governments getting involved at a diplomatic level. And yet, the question remains, if at the border where our troops are deployed, will there be no friction here on? And the big news coming in, Prime Minister Narendra Modi's statement at the BRICS summit in Russia, and this is at the closed plenary session of the 16th BRICS summit. Prime Minister Narendra Modi says, and I quote it here, "We all have to be united and cooperate strongly to deal with terrorism and terror financing. There is no place for double standard on such a serious issue. We should take active steps to prevent radicalization among the youth of our countries. And we have to work together on the pending issue of comprehensive convention on international terrorism in the United Nations." Huge, huge statement that is coming in. Remember, India, that has been impacted immensely because of the terror issues coming in, while of course from Pakistan, but as much from China. And therefore, at a time like this, and we remember as much, whether in West Asia, in the Middle East, across the world in different countries, there have been the concerns of not only terrorism, but radicalization of young men and women. And that is why India opting to talk straight, direct about the impact of terrorism and how the world has to unite and has to cooperate to deal with terrorism. This is very important. This is not about India or Israel or the Middle East or any other nation. This is about a global unity when it comes to fighting terrorism and terror financing. Look at the words that the Indian Prime Minister has chosen. It's not just about terror network or terrorism, but terror financing, where the money is coming in to fund these terror groups. Also adding, I quote it again here, there is no place for double standard on such a serious issue, that you will have to take a stand as a country. Also adding that we all need to take active steps to prevent radicalization among the youth in our countries. We have to work together on the pending issue of Comprehensive Convention on International Terrorism in the United Nations. So that's a massive statement that's coming in from India about specifically the terror issues. Remember, for example, even Israel maintains that this is a fight against terrorism and terror groups like Hamas, Hezbollah, Houthis, backed by Iran. On the other side, India has been facing Pakistan-sponsored terrorism, not just in the Kashmir Valley or in Jammu region, but in different parts of the country, including the Mumbai terror attacks. Then there are, of course, also border issues and incursions by China. All of this talking straight and crisp on the international platform of BRICS Summit, of which India is a founding member, but which is also expanding. Remember, Middle East is very clear. Middle Eastern nations, and specifically the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, which are also reforming, increasingly modernizing, have also said that their fight against terrorism is very clear, and that in fact they stand with India on issues that there need not be a double standard in this case. So the Indian Prime Minister making it very clear about the kind of strategy that the world needs to have, and that is not work individually as a country, but unite, cooperate and strongly deal with terrorism and terror financing. There is no place for double standards on such an issue, and we should take active steps to prevent radicalization among the youth. We have to work together on the Comprehensive Convention on International Terrorism at the United Nations. So to take in all the organizations globally to get together and to ensure that at this point, the fight against terrorism should not be as a burden on one nation, but a collective voice together globally. Our Foreign Affairs Editor Geeta Mohan joining me on the phone line on this. Geeta, this is a big statement because I find it very interesting that the focus for India has been terrorism and against terror financing, and how the world must unite on this.
Absolutely. This is, again, a call to all those who sit at the high table at the United Nations, saying that it does not work when there is no definition, no agreement or consensus on even defining terrorism at a time when India faces terror attacks almost on a very, very regular basis, Pooja. So Prime Minister Narendra Modi highlighting that, talking about counter-terrorism and terror financing, but also exposing the world's double standards on such a serious matter, where no one country or no country, countries together cannot come on one issue, that is fight against terror, and the active steps that need to be taken to stop radicalization of youth in various countries. Very, very important statement at a time when India is not only battling terror from across the border, but also radicalization and extremist movements in various countries, particularly in the recent past that we've seen the Khalistani movement gaining momentum in countries like Canada, the United Kingdom, including some parts in America, and certainly a matter of concern where India's interests and concerns have not been taken into account.
All right, so that's what, Geeta, that you're telling us about is very important. And remember, making it very clear about how BRICS is an organization willing to evolve with time. And we must collectively, united manner, raise our voice for reforms of global institutions, different, whether it's the UN Security Council, multilateral development banks, and the WTO. So it's a global voice that we need to become. And he also mentioned the G20 presidency, that India was hosting the Global South summits and more. And confident that in the times to come, Prime Minister Modi said, we will together make this unique platform a model for dialogue, cooperation and coordination. So that big statement that has been made by Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, has also delivered a message of peace meanwhile when he met Russian President Vladimir Putin and the Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian. During the India-Russia bilateral, Prime Minister Modi also said that the conflict that's presently on between Russia and Ukraine must be resolved through dialogue and diplomacy. Remember that India is friends, both with Russia and Ukraine. And therefore, at this time, India has offered, if there is any help or assistance required, to possibly take the route of humanity to support stability, bring peace. India is ready to pitch in. Prime Minister Modi also then met the Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian on the sidelines of the BRICS summit. Again, another conflict in the West Asia. India has been friends with Israel, but also a civilizational, cultural friend with Iran. And therefore asking there, apart from condoling the deaths that have taken place in Iran, to exercise restraint, step back from violence, and try to return to path of diplomacy.
एक्सेलेंसी, रूस और यूक्रेन के बीच चल रहे संघर्ष के विषय पर हम लगातार संपर्क में रहे हैं। जैसा मैंने पहले भी कहा है, हमारा मानना है कि समस्याओं का समाधान शांतिपूर्ण तरीके से ही होना चाहिए। शांति और स्थिरता की जल्द से जल्द बहाली का हम पूरी तरह समर्थन करते हैं। हमारे सभी प्रयास मानवता को प्रमुखता देते हैं। आने वाले समय में भी भारत हर संभव सहयोग देने के लिए तैयार है।
Государства стояли у истоков создания объединения.
हम रूस और भारत के बीच जो सहयोग चल रहा है, हम वो बहुत महत्वपूर्ण मानते हैं।
И очередное заседание межправкомиссии намечено на 12 ноября в Нью-Дели.
और 12 दिसंबर को नई दिल्ली में अंतर सरकारी आयोग की अगली बैठक होने वाली है।
Последовательно развиваются крупные проекты.
हमारी बड़ी परियोजनाएं लगातार विकसित हो रहे हैं।
И мы приветствуем ваше решение открыть в Казани Генеральное консульство Индии.
और जो आपने कजान में भारत का कौंसल जनरल खोलने का निर्णय लिया, हम इसका स्वागत करते हैं।
Расширение дипломатического присутствия Индии в России будет способствовать дальнейшему развитию двухсторонних отношений.
भारत के कूटनीतिक उपस्थिति से हमारे सहयोग को फायदा मिलेगा।
Уважаемый господин премьер-министр, мы очень рады видеть вас и всю вашу представительную команду в России.
माननीय प्रधानमंत्री जी, हम आपको और आपकी प्रतिनिधि मंडल रूस में देखने से हमको बड़ी खुशी है।
The leaders also shared perspectives on the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. Prime Minister reiterated that dialogue and diplomacy was the way forward to achieve resolution of the conflict. He briefed President Putin about his engagements with the Ukrainian leadership and noted that India stood ready to contribute in bringing peace. Prime Minister congratulated him on his recent victory and reaffirmed India's commitment to deepening the age-old bilateral ties with Iran. In fact, both leaders emphasized repeatedly the shared historical and civilizational ties that underpin their bilateral relations. The discussion focused on key areas of cooperation, particularly the Chabahar port and the international north-south transport corridor.
So let me take you through now the latest images that are coming in from the BRICS summit. Just about a few hours ago, it was the group photograph with which the BRICS leaders and the summit basically kick-started. Look at where the positioning is, as the Indian Prime Minister standing right next to Vladimir Putin, and with him was the UAE Crown Prince. Remember, this is also reflective of the position India has as a founding member, as much as how perhaps the two leaders, Vladimir Putin and Prime Minister Modi, are close. But interesting to see China, India, Russia together, a moment of camaraderie, friendship among the three leaders. Prime Minister Modi seen giving a thumbs up as Russian President Putin and Chinese counterpart Xi Jinping engaged in a conversation. PM Modi and Chinese President seen sharing space at the dinner concert hosted for the BRICS leaders, and that was hosted by the Russian President. And this, remember, is also at a time that seated between them is the Russian President. But some light-hearted moments as well. Tapping a foot during the informal dinner in Kazan. That was to the Russian folk song Kalinka that was being played. It also was popular in India. It was adapted to one of the movies. And some of those leaders, dignitaries, took out a moment from the serious talks to perhaps enjoy some music. In a significant display of diplomatic solidarity, Russian jets escorting Chinese President Xi Jinping's plane, the aircraft when he arrived in Kazan for the 16th BRICS summit. So as I head into a short break, let me share a light-hearted moment that happened at the BRICS summit. Remember, this is a lot of serious trade and technology ties talk between countries. But when Prime Minister Modi and Russian President Vladimir Putin were interacting, he also said to the Prime Minister, you don't really need a translator when I speak. It appears that you can understand without a translator what I mean, reflective of the friendship between the two leaders.
Мы должны принять целый ряд важных решений, направленных на дальнейшее совершенствование деятельности объединения и укрепление многопланового сотрудничества в его рамках. У нас такие отношения, что я считал, что вы и так все понимаете.
हमारे इतने रिश्ते हैं कि मुझे ऐसा लगा कि आपको कोई अनुवाद नहीं चाहिए.
Right, the big news coming in is about the statement that Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi has made, and I quote from here. Remember, this is the statement that has been made at the 16th BRICS summit, and specifically, and I quote about how the focus was very clear, that we have to be united and cooperate strongly to deal with terrorism and terror financing. There is no place for double standard on such a serious issue, and that we should take active steps to prevent radicalization among the youth in our countries. He's basically also asking that there has to be global cooperation on this and not individually as a fight that the nation must do against terror. He also added that we have to work together on the pending issue of the Comprehensive Convention on International Terrorism in the United Nations. So that's the big news coming in, a very clear, crisp statement from Prime Minister Modi. And after India, China has also made a big statement at the BRICS. Chinese President Xi Jinping speaking at the BRICS summit. And I quote what China has said. We face the choice of leaving the world turbulent or take it back to peace. China also adds, and I quote here, important to push peaceful agenda of the BRICS to sustain security. Very interesting comments coming in. Remember, while India's statement was very clear about global cooperation, fight against terror, to also understand the responsibility that we have at BRICS, China says that we face the choice of leaving the world turbulent or take it back to peace. Important to push a peaceful agenda of the BRICS summit to sustain security amid as the global alliances. Remember, BRICS and China and India of it are founding members, even though now, of course, they are expanding and other nations, specifically South Africa and from the Middle East, are also coming in. Right, so that's a big statement that is coming from the Chinese President Xi Jinping, saying that we need to ensure that we take this ahead for sustainability globally, and also to that the stability and security that need to come, specifically to ensure that we do not make the world more turbulent. That's what the Chinese president has to say. Remember, in less than half an hour now, we are going to have possibly the bilateral meeting to begin between Prime Minister Narendra Modi and Chinese President Xi Jinping. The two leaders, the two nations basically meeting at this level after 5 years, after 2019. And that meeting was before the 2020 Galwan clash had happened, where the tensions had peaked between India and China at the line of actual control. But now, can we expect, after certain announcements of patrolling arrangements, phased disengagement from different points, can we reach a certain level of negotiations and understanding that the Chinese incursions will not be attempted at the LAC? We're looking at the visuals of the BRICS summit when it started, and that was where Prime Minister Narendra Modi next to Vladimir Putin.